Greetings, traveler.
Let's have a look at all the new Murloc and Dragon stuff. First up, we have Wannabe Gargoyle. It's a tier 4 5/1 reborn, which is not unplayable on its own. It's not insane, but that's fine. It deals 5 damage, comes back, deals 5 damage again. But it has a text, this is reborn with full attack, which might seem a little bit weird because yeah, of course, it comes back with its damage, but what it means is if it has damage buffs, it'll come back with those buffs. So we can turn this into a 20 damage dragon that reborns with 20 damage, which is nice. That's essentially like a Divine Shield. The really good part is when this gets goldened, it reborns with full attack and health. And all of a sudden we have a fantastic target for buffs, similar to the beast we once had called Blanchy. That one, when it reborned, it also kept stats and I believe enhancements as well. So it would come back with Divine Shield. It was really, really good. This, not quite as good, but still a really, really good target to just dump stats on. We can throw a bunch of spells on this. We can utilize Brand to give this a lot of buffs. So really fun card to buy early, get a pair of, and then hopefully triple, and just keep it on your board for the whole game and just throw a bunch of stats on it. Then we have Depraved Felfin, which we've already covered in the Demon release. It is a multi-type minion, a Demon Murloc. We talked about this. It's at first glance, it doesn't seem to have that much utility because you're discovering cards. I guess when you're jamming a bunch of Primal Fins, this can still rack up quite some stats, so you can put it on the board. But generally speaking, whenever you're playing Brand, Primal Fin setups, it's not like you have a lot of extra board space, so this might be tough to fit. I did mention that this is going to be super fun on Cat, because if you have your Cat Hero Power trigger, you do get to discover whichever minion you want, and most of the time in the middle and the late game, you discover quite some stats with this. So very specific on that hero, super fun minion. And then the last card is Merglin Burglar, which fantastic name. After you play a Murloc, give a friendly Murloc and a minion in your hand +6/+6. Super fun. So this is exactly what you need for Bream support. Whenever you play the base skill Bream Coral build, it does okay, but it's really missing that punch, and this really adds a huge reward for going for this hyper Primal Fin centered playstyle where you have your Bran, your Murka, your Primal Fin, you fill your hand with a bunch of Murlocs, and then your entire turn is just buy, sell, empty my hand, try to get Trigger Battlecry on my Golden Primal Fin, buy every TAD I see. So this is just going to be great. If you have multiples on these, your board grows and your hand gets really big, which then makes your Coral Murglers huge. So just overall hyper synergistic, a super nice engine card to add to your Primal Fin setup. Then we have a few cards coming back. Twilight Emissary, not a super exciting minion, just a neat little battle cry early, works really well with Skyfin, Whelp Smuggler, that kind of stuff. Warpwing, which is much more impactful. This essentially was the reason why you would bother playing Caligos. It's so that you could have 2 Warpwings and buff them like crazy. So I'm super happy that this card is back. At first glance, this card might not seem insane if you haven't played with it before, because you're like, well, it could just get attacked and die. But essentially the strategy with Warping is to taunt your whole board except your 2 Warpwings. You play with Bran, you play with Caligos, you play tons of Drakasats, which gives you a lot of those 5/1 buffer dragons, which not only triggers your Caligos, but also makes your Warpwings deal so much damage. And it's not uncommon for a Warpwing to get 3 or 4 hits in with a full taunt board, and then your Warpwings just in the front, sometimes healthy enough to survive enemy attacks, just increasing the number of hits they can get in. These things are also just lethal against token setups, because token setups have generally small chunks of damage that they deal, which is fantastic for the Warping. It just means that you can have a Warping just deal so much free damage because the enemy is not one-shotting it. Honcho is back, just, you know, neat little Murloc to buy early. There once was a meta where this was actually a card people would build around, believe it or not, where you would just have multiple golden Honchos and then just cycle a bunch of TADs and then put poison on all your Murlocs with the SI7. But that was a long time ago. Now poison is out, you can only give venomous, and this has been nerfed repeatedly, but on tier 1, it's just a neat little start, right? It still rewards you for playing Tad, and it goes pretty well with other early Murlocs. And then for the last returning minion, we have Mercules, which honestly is one of my favorite early game minions. You can use the little taunt slime to give this +2/+2 and taunt, which is a fantastic feeling if your opponent is running early tokens, such as a Bonehead. Oh, that feeling when it's just like, bam, +2/+2, bam, +2/+2. And especially if you're buffing another Mercules in your hand, you could triple it, and now you have a golden taunted Mercules. If you're super lucky, you can even triple this while you're on tier 3 and roll a Dire Muck. So now you have a golden Mercules in your hand, and it just buffs itself, which is super good. And then you can just play the golden card later on when you're on tier 5 to pull a 6-drop. So fantastic early game minion if you can get it rolling. It's rather disappointing if you can't, but super nice if you can get the ball rolling. So again, taunting it, generally speaking, can have some really good outcomes in, say, an undead lobby where people will run these small attack minions such as Bonehead or Risen Rider. Then we have some removed cards. Rockpool is out, that makes sense, gotta make space for Honcho. Murgle Mark II is out, which was actually a really nice card. Needed to be nerfed from Avenge 3 to Avenge 4, but there's not gonna be any Menace anymore, there's not gonna be any Ratback anymore, so probably wouldn't have been that good anymore. Magmalock out, kind of just comes and goes. Not a super influential card in the meta we've just had. 1000 Paper Drake is actually quite important that goes, because you can't have this and Warping in the same meta, because Wind Fury Warping is insane. There are certain ways to give it Wind Fury. The one that comes to mind is you can use the ticket as prize to give a dog a bone to give it Wind Fury Divine Shield, which is insane on Warping. Like, hands down the best target. Like, it's better than Foe Reaper to give it Wind Fury and Divine Shield, because it will not lose that Divine Shield when it attacks, and with the Wind Fury you just attack twice and you keep your shield, and it's fantastic. So yeah, you can't have those two in the same meta. Nightbane has been nerfed to a tier 5, so please excuse the tier 4 here, but I mean, the point stands, the card is going to leave, which I think is super important. This whole meta has just been Nightbane this, Nightbane that. It's insane with Kel'Thuzad, so I'm very happy to see the card go, and we can have a little bit more room to build stats again, because Nightbane really punished you if you tried to build a board with just generic big minions with big health, because Nightbane would essentially give all your minions poison. Because if you have 1000 damage, I mean, yeah, okay, I have a 500 unit, which is great, but it gets one-shot by this 1000 damage Divine Shield unit, so what's the point? Murlocs is out. That is such an iconic minion, which I'm absolutely going to miss. This is one of the most fun minions to play with Brand, because you never know what you're gonna get. You could just steal 2 Brands and all of a sudden you have a golden Brand. So many of my insane Power Spike games have come from a lucky Murlocs. And then we see Winter Finner going out, which makes sense. That's essentially the same slot as Mercules, so, you know, having both of those wouldn't really make sense. Our first lesser trinket is the Alliance Keychain. The first time a friendly minion dies each combat, give its maximum stats to a random friendly minion. Now that phrasing, maximum stats, is important, because if it were to get Bramble Witched and it would just say stats, then I would assume that we'd be getting 3/3, but now because of maximum stats, even if it gets Bramble Witched, we should get the whole thing. At least that's how I interpret it. This can be extremely good if you have Poet on your board, seeing as this is a combat buff, which can be a very significant one if you have a huge minion as your first minion that dies, and then the Poet can make that buff permanent. Seems like a nice little dragon trinket. However, I think this can also be super interesting in a demon lobby, where you just create a huge taunted demon, and then you have cultists, and then you really double dip, where you're getting the advantage of this huge demon dying, and you're transferring the stats, and you resummon it with Cultist. Of course, there is always that recurring problem where if Bramble Witch is in, it will still get nerfed to a 3/3, and it will affect your Cultists, not the keychain. And if you build a minion that is so large that it doesn't die, something else will attack and die. So I think when you're playing this, it would serve you well to have a lot of Divine Shield minions on your board, or say a Warpwing, something that attacks and doesn't die, because you want to give yourself the maximum amount of time to let your opponent kill off that huge taunt. This can be very frustrating against beasts, because beasts tend to play a lot of small minions at the start, where the Macaw attacks, the Goldrin attacks, or heaven forbid against Leapers, and then your big minion isn't dead after 5 of their attacks, and you end up killing a small minion. So this can be a little bit frustrating, but I think there's a lot of cool things, and especially with Poet, this could be a ton of free stats in the mid game. Belcher Portrait. For 4 gold, you get a Belcher, and then whenever a friendly minion loses Venomous, it gains 5/5 permanently. Now I assume again this works when the minion loses Venomous but dies, so it still gets the permanent stats. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to get your Belcher. Some scaling if it doesn't work on a 2 health Belcher. So this works with Spore. We have seen Spore reintroduced in the neutral video. So early on, let's say there's a Spore in your shop and you roll this portrait, you can say, okay, well, I have Belcher, I can venom a different Murloc, and then I can buy the Spore, and now I have 3 units gaining 5/5 every combat. And if my opponent has a huge taunt, I can punish them with a venom. So overall, this seems fine. I don't think this is something that is horrible. I don't think it's insane. It's just something that gives you a little bit of direction, and it will automatically push you a little bit more in the scam direction because you will want a lot of venomous units. So that's never awful for MMR gain. Having a lot of venomous units on the board means you kill a lot of your enemy minions, which means you never really take a ton of damage. Again, this is assuming your opponent isn't running beasts, because against the beast composition, this is horrible. Venom is not good against beast because they summon lots of small things. Dragonwing Glider is our next trinket. For 1 gold, you get the effect, whenever you play a card, give a friendly dragon +3 attack. Now there is some cool stuff you can do with this, because this says card, it doesn't say minion. So you can play cheap spells or any other cheap cards you can get your hands on and combo this with Whelp Smuggler, and then you can make a huge dragon. You could also get Hunter of Gatherers and have that be your only dragon, and then you can truly give your board tons of stats where every time you play a card, it's just bing, 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 just so many procs on this Hunter. So I think that this is a cool trinket that has some cool applications, and if you don't get to build that and you just have a lot of dragons, you can still just have Whelp Smuggler with Poets and just build a dragon board, sort of more the old-fashioned way, and just have a nice little bonus. But I really think this could be a cool setup where you just have either an amalgam and a Whelp Smuggler, and then you play something completely different, but you just have a huge dragon, or you have a Hunter of Gatherers and you utilize the effect to just buff your whole board. Holy Mallet, for 3 gold, we're getting a shield in our left and rightmost minion. Now this is most likely just dragon support, right? We're revealing the dragon card, so you can use this with Poet to give permanent divine shield, you can use this with Taragosa to get permanent divine shield. You might say, well, we could use this with Titus to give the Titus divine shield during the combat, which isn't awful, but you have to give your leftmost minion divine shield as well. So probably that's a Macaw, because you want to attack first with your Macaw, and if it has Reborn, you really want it to die. Now this could be interesting with Leapers, and then you can have your Macaw survive, and then you can proc again. So there is still some option to use this with Titus, but most likely you're just going to run this with dragons and give permanent divine shields. Nurglish Phrasebook. For 1 gold, you get the effect, after you play a minion, give the leftmost minion in your hand 3/3. So this does specify minion, so it's going to be much harder to just full spam, which makes a lot of sense because you're getting +3/3 rather than just +3 attack. The way how this generally will be used is to have a Bream counter and then play a lot of minions and just get an additional effect of that Bream counter. However, I think one thing you can do in order to get your game rolling is to pick up the Nurglish Phrasebook and then have a huge turn. Let's say you're on tier 4, you buy and hold a Cleave, and then the next turn you just buy a lot of cards, play a lot of cards, and then the last thing you play is the Cleave, and suddenly you have a Giga Cleave. This is probably how you have to run this trinket in the early game in order to stabilize, because it's not going to be very useful if you don't have the Bream, the base skill, and you're not operational yet. You're probably going to have to buff a Divine Shield or a Cleave, stabilize from that, and then try to find the Bream and just use it for huge hand buff Murlocs. Rockin' Music Box. At the end of each turn, get a random Battlecry minion. Pretty good with Bran, it's decent value. You're getting a Battlecry every turn, so this can also be used with Caligos, generally in a Murloc comp. I think it's a little slow compared to a lot of the other trinkets we've seen, because essentially you're paying 4 gold, you're getting nothing on this turn, and then at the end of the turn you get a Battlecry, which is probably still on tier 3, so it's not going to be a huge impact. So Initially, this feels a little bit too slow. Maybe you can get away with it if you already have a really strong board and you can invest in the future. But from what I can gather now, this seems like it's not going to be my favorite pick just because it's a little bit like I'm paying 4 gold and I'm getting nothing on this turn, and it's not like I'm getting a massive power spike afterwards either. Smuggler Portrait. I do like this one. For 1 gold, you get a Whelp Smuggler, and then your Whelp Smugglers are also dragons. So this can be really nice if you already have a Whelp Smuggler on the board, and then you say have a Rallier where you can buff your dragons like that, or you have a Synthesizer in the shop that you can play and get a lot of attack, a lot of health. And then you can even run the spell Guzzle the Goop, which will give your whole board damage, which if you have 2 Whelp Smugglers will then also give your whole board health and a lot of damage, and the Whelp Smugglers are now also relevant. So this overall just seems like a really fun, neat little thing to do, and it only costs 1 gold. So here I am a fan of this one. Training Certificate. For 4 gold, you get the effect, start of combat, double the stats of your lowest attack minions. This says double the stats, not just double the damage. So we are looking at a dragon trinket again, because when you have Poet, you can essentially continuously double your stats. Now, the issue with this trinket is that in the very beginning, you are going to have some really, really low statted minions. So the effect of this is not going to be that huge. And if you have Poet on the board, Poet is going to be your lowest attack minion, probably for quite a while. So what you really need is 2 Poets so that they can buff each other and remember the buffs. And then you can get bigger dragons, and then you can remember the buff like that. So at first glance, again, this seems a little bit too tricky to get going. But if you get it going, it says double. And we all know, right, when things just double and then double again and double again, they get very big very fast. In the right circumstance, I can see people using this to great effect. Right now, it seems a little bit too tricky to create those right circumstances. So again, I'm happy to be proven wrong and people figure out how to use this. But right now, I think I'm probably just going to end up dying if I try to make this work. Twin Sky Lanterns. When you have space, summon a copy for the first minion you summon each combat. We've seen this already. This has already been released in a previous video, but there's some cool stuff here with Automaton, which is not what you would normally think, right? You would think that, oh, this is nice for base skill. I can just have a huge Murloc in my hand, use the base skill, summon another huge Murloc, which is good, don't get me wrong. But the buff for the Automaton is an aura, which means that if you say Reborn and summon another Automaton, it will have all the stats it's supposed to have, similar to a Eternal Knight. So with Twin Sky Lantern, if you, let's say, just summon a small Automaton, it's not quite small because it'll get all the aura buffs. And then whenever you have space, you summon another one, which then increases the amount of buffs. So seems like a cool thing to use off color, if you will, where, yeah, it could be used for Murlocs, but you can also use this for the mech comp or you're pumping good stats with Automaton. Now we have Valorous Medallion. For 2 gold, you get a very straightforward, simple effect. Start of combat, give your minions 2/2. We've seen this before. It's a nice little tempo boost with the Alexstrasza buddy, although that one had Battle Cry, give your minions stats, and then also a continuous effect. But this is still nice if you have a setup for dragons, because when you have this, you're generally, again, going to want to lean into something that can use Poet, so then you can make that buff permanent on some of your dragons. Then we have the Greater Trinkets. Alliance Keychain is just an upgrade, so essentially everything we've talked about for the lesser version applies here, but you get it for 2 minions. Bronze Timepiece, we've also already covered. Set each of your minions' attack and health to the higher of the 2. We first talked about this with Undead, where you can make huge attack with Undead. Now dragons can also make huge attack, but keep in mind that Nightbane is out. So you're definitely not going to see these insanely high attack numbers that we're used to in the current dragon meta. You could even use Whelp Smuggler to get a lot of HP on your dragons, and now you can equalize that by getting a lot of attack. So absolutely some shenanigans available for dragons as well. Twin Sky Lantern, same deal. You now summon 2 copies, so all the stuff we talked about, huge Bream in the hands with base skill, Automaton, it's just twice as good here. Essence of Dreams. For 2 gold, you get a Dreamer's Embrace. At the start of each turn, get another. Now, this is a greater trinket, so this is going to be very, very situational. If you already have Bran, if you already have Primal Fin, if you already have a Golden Primal Fin, this is obviously going to be very good. If you don't have any Battle Cry support, this doesn't really seem worth it for a greater trinket at all. But it could be very, very good in keeping your snowball rolling if you already have a Battle Cry centered setup. Emerald Dreamcatcher for 4 gold. Start of combat, set your dragon's attack to the highest in your warband. This again seems really good if you have the setup, if you have Poets, because now what you can do is you can have one huge attack dragon, and you can now transfer the stats to all your dragons with poets. It'll be permanent. You now have huge attack on your board. Poet is probably a little less important here just because this effect will happen every single turn, but it's still a Divine Shield dragon, and Poet can then help to make that highest attack even higher with something like a Promo Drake or a previous trinket that you have used. You can also combo this with the Glider we talked about earlier. You can make a huge dragon early and then add more dragons later, and now all of a sudden you have a lot of very high attack dragons, which works the best with Divine Shield. Warp Wings in the late game. Warp Wings generally don't care that much about the health. Sure, it's nice to have a lot of health, but if you just have Giga attack, it works pretty well. So I can absolutely see this being used in that capacity. Nurglish Phrasebook, same deal. This is now the greater version. Here, I would say it's a little less so that you're going to pop off to stabilize, but you can still use this with magnetics. So let's say you have a Foe Reaper on the board. You can buy a Lullabot, play tons of minions, and then have a huge Lullabot that you can attach to Foe Reaper. Probably, again, the most useful thing here is to have a Bream counter, and you take this to have a massive Bream counter, which is then in turn going to make your corals bigger. You could combo this then with the Lantern from the previous tier, so the smaller Lantern, and you have a Nurglish Phrasebook, so that way you can summon a huge Bream and then a copy of that with base skill, of course. Or the other way around, you could start with the small Phrasebook and then the Twin Lantern. So that does seem like a cool little combo. One of these to buff the hand and the other one to then double the summons. Belcher Portrait, number 2. So just more scam. I have a feeling that this could be a good pickup when your game is just not going that well and you say, well, what am I doing? Oh, okay, here's a Belcher Portrait. Let me just play Belcher. Let me try to get Titus. We could even get something like Macaw to get multiple procs. My board will grow a little bit. I will get some Venom, and I hopefully just get a decent placement. There is also some potential here where you can continuously reapply Venomous to get a lot of extra buffs. But that would require most of the time to have a Titus and then probably like a Taunted Amalgam. I think if you have a Taunted Amalgam that has a lot of HP so it survives, you could technically keep on giving it Venom and then it could keep getting bigger when it loses the Venom. Especially if you have a Macaw that somehow didn't die, it can attack again, proc the Belcher again, buff again, but this is all very situational. I would say for the most part, this is just, okay, now I have a Belcher, my game wasn't really going anywhere, and now I can just scam better. Shaman Prayer Beats, we've seen this in other reveals, it's just nice. Every time you buy 2 Battle Cries, you get a random Battle Cry minion, super good with Bran, allows for APM setup, so be quite interested in trying this myself. Valor's Medallion, the upgrade. 5/5 at start of combat. Here, I feel like this just isn't quite good enough, even if I have poets on my board, just because I'm competing with some really cool stuff in other greater trinkets. So while I'm okay with a 2/2 early on, just getting 5/5 later on feels like, you know, compared to a lot of the greater trinkets we've seen, this doesn't really cut it for me. Then we have Glider, the upgrade, +6 attack every time you play a card. Could be interesting if you just had a unrelated game where you just have a random board that maybe just has a Hunter of Gatherers, then combined with this. You could still just run whatever you want, but then one of your cards is Hunter of Gatherers, it's your only dragon, and then you can still pump a ton of damage on it, giving a lot of HP. Again, for the most part, I'm probably going to want something else for my greater trinket, but at least this is only 1 gold. So if I'm not really happy with the other choices, I can still spend the remainder of my gold on something more powerful. Then we have Tiny Fin 1Z. Start of the combat, your leftmost minion gains the stats of the highest health minion in your hand. There's a combo here. What this is designed to do, I suppose, is to have a huge Bream counter in your hand and then get a nice little tempo spike. What we want to use this for is to combine this with an Amalgam and Poet. Because if we now have a huge Bream in our hand from, say, a book from earlier, right? We just have the tier 1 version. We use this to make a big Bream. This thing can give my Amalgam that's on the far left all the stats, and I have a Poet next to it. So even though this is supposed to be just a combat buff, I now have a permanent buff. So that can give you a huge minion, because if you have like a 200-200 Bream, this is plus 200-200 and probably increasing every turn. Really nice. The problem is, if people know that you have this, they're just gonna like taunt a Leroy. And then you have to put it on the left and it has to attack and then it's gonna go into Leroy. So this is more a problem for higher level battlegrounds where people will actively scout and see what trinkets you have, but it's a nice little bonus, I suppose. If you see somebody has this, generally taunting a Leroy is going to counter it like crazy because they will have a huge minion on the left, for a fact. And if they don't, then their whole comp sucks, because that means they don't have a big minion in your hand. While it does sound completely unethical and crazy, at higher levels of play, you will telegraph incredibly well what you're going to do, and you will give your opponent the out. Luckily, you can still Divine Shield it, so it will pretty much just be Leroy. It's not going to be, oh, I have a Venom, right? You could have a Divine Shield minion there, and then if you attack into a Venom, it will still survive. Bran! Right, so a Bronzebeard portrait. You get a Bran for 1 gold. That's cool, call it a day. Wait, there's more. Your Bran also is a Murloc and a dragon. I love this. This is so much fun. Is this the most powerful portrait in the game? Yes, because it gives you Bran, but also no. But I just have this huge love for Bran. It's my favorite minion in the game by far, because it just enables these cool turns where it seems like you just never run out of things to do. Oh, there's a panda, I get 2 spells, the panda discovers me a battle cry, the battle cry is a primal fin, and you just keep going. So this is just super fun because now you can scale your Bran. It'll get buffs from Caligos, it'll get buffs from Murky Murkai, any kind of AoE dragon or AoE Murloc buff you're doing. You can now technically make this permanent Divine Shield with Poet and all cool stuff. While this sounds completely broken, like, oh, I'm getting a Bran and I can also buff it, other people are also getting a greater trinket. And they might be doing some really good stuff with their greater trinket, like stealthing a Titus or, you know, any of the other crazy stuff we've seen so far. But this is at the very least going to be fun. It only costs 1 gold. It can help you make golden Bran. You could technically play 2 Brans because you could scale them now. And it's a lot easier to justify having 2 Brans, which you need to make the golden Bran. And, you know, just overall seems like a super fun trinket to play with. That was it for all the Murloc and Dragon cards. Now that we've seen all the reveals, what do you think is going to be the strongest type? Let me know in the comments. All right, seems like that's it. All right, good thing we can edit this out. Don't leave it in. The Hunter of Gatherers. Yes, so if you have Hunter of Gatherers,